The true foundation. We are faithfully to build the church on Christ, who He is and what He taught. Here's Gene.
The Apostle Paul goes on in this letter and uses a couple of metaphors to demonstrate the importance of this principle. And the reason this principle emerges from this passage is that the Corinthians were violating this principle in terms of building on Christ. And first of all, he uses this metaphor, God's field. God's field, God's servants. And so, here's what Paul says. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Now remember, when he wrote to them, right in the opening chapter, he says, it's reported that some of you say, I follow Peter. Some of you say, I follow Apollos. Some of you say, I follow Paul, me. And some of you even say, I follow Christ, but you do that with some arrogance. And he said, that is not the way it should be. And so he's picking up on that theme here in chapter 3 and says, what then is Apollos? What is Paul? Referring to himself. They are servants through whom you believed, and each has the role the Lord has given. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. God gave the growth. Now, he's not saying that God didn't use them, but what he is saying is that only God can give the growth, and he says that right here in this verse. So then, neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. Now, it takes effort to sow the seed. It takes effort to communicate the gospel. It takes effort to be able to help people to grow. But when all is said and done, only God gives the growth. And he said, you have forgotten that. And so he's addressing that situation. Now, he's not saying we shouldn't honor leaders. In another passage, for example, in 1 Thessalonians, he says this, now we ask you, brothers and sisters, to give recognition to those who labor among you and lead you in the Lord and admonish you, and to regard them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. In other words, he's not saying we shouldn't honor leaders, but what they began to do in Corinth was to honor leaders above God. And what happened? It created disunity. And isn't it interesting that right at the end of this paragraph, writing to the Thessalonians, he says, honor leaders, but be at peace among yourselves. Just the opposite of what was happening in Corinth. They weren't honoring leaders per se as God says they should be honored. They were elevating leaders to a place even above God. And it created all of this disunity, all of this problem. So the first metaphor, he says, you're God's field. We're just sowing the seed, but God is the one that gives the growth. Then he uses another metaphor, God's building. Chapter 3, verse 9, he says, for we are God's co-workers. You're God's field. Using that metaphor, we sowed the seed. But then he says, you're God's building. Another metaphor. According to God's grace that was given to me, I have laid a foundation as a skilled master builder. He acknowledges that. He was an apostle. And another builds on it, Apollos. But each one is to be careful how he builds on it. Now, evidently, there were other people that emerged within the Corinthian church that were actually building on the foundation in ways that were just totally selfish. He says, for no one can lay any other foundation than what has been laid down. That foundation is Jesus Christ. And there he is speaking to the people that are elevating even him, Paul, above Jesus Christ. He says that's totally wrong. Elevating Apollos above Jesus Christ. He says the only true foundation is the foundation of Jesus Christ. Now, he goes on to talk about rewards and losses. And this gets very graphic. He's very direct. Paul says, if anyone builds on the foundation, what is the foundation? Jesus Christ. If anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, and costly stones, that's a positive statement. Gold, silver, costly stones, metaphors to illustrate building on Jesus Christ. But then he says, wood, hay, or straw. That's a negative statement. And he said there are a lot of people in Corinth that are building on the foundation of men rather than the foundation of Christ, and it's all wood, and it's hay, and it's straw. And what's going to happen? Well, let's just get the flow. If anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, costly stones, or wood, hay, or straw, each one's work will become obvious, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire. The fire will test the quality of each one's work. There's a time where God will evaluate the way in which we build on the foundation. And he's speaking primarily to leaders here. If anyone's work that he has built survives, he will receive a reward. Now, the reward there is not salvation. They had salvation. The reward was a reward, really using a metaphor from the Olympic Games, a reward for serving faithfully, building with gold and silver and precious stones. But if anyone's work is burned up, that is, that's wood, hay, or stubble, he will experience loss, but he himself will be saved, but only as through the fire. He's not talking about salvation here. He's talking about rewards that will be given to those who are faithful. Now, look at this question, and it'll set the stage, I think, for another very significant aspect of what Paul is teaching. How do Paul's exhortations regarding leadership in the church apply to all members of the body of Jesus Christ? Well, what we have here is that Paul is actually talking about the bema. And the bema, that Greek word, is used in 2 Corinthians 5:10. And the bema really referred to a place, yes, of judgment, but a place where they gave out awards. You see, Corinth was right there in the Isthmus, and they had the Isthmus Games, which were really Olympic Games. And you'll see actually a picture on this slide of the bema. It still exists today if you go to Corinth. And it was from that bema that awards were given for faithfulness or for success in running the race appropriately, for example. So the focus here is not so much on judgment, but on awards. I think in some respects where it's translated, and let me read how it's translated, for we must all appear before the bema. But here's translated, the judgment seat of Christ. And so a lot of times we focus on the judgment rather than the awards that are given or not given. And he goes on to say, so that each may be repaid for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. Now, he's not talking about the future. He's not talking about heaven. He's talking about, he is talking about the future, but he's talking about the fact that we will be rewarded as believers depending on how faithful we have been. And he's talking to these Corinthians very directly in terms of the fact that a lot of what they're doing is going to be burned up in the end. They'll be saved, but they'll have no rewards. And so Paul is dealing here with a very significant issue in this church. But we still come back to that question. How do Paul's exhortations regarding leadership in the church apply to all members of the body of Christ? See, he's first of all talking to leaders. That's the primary issue here in the Corinthian church, and the way people were abusing that. But if you look at Ephesians 4:16, we're all involved in building up the body of Christ. And he wrote to the Ephesians, he said, from him, Jesus, the whole body, fitted and knit together by every supporting ligament, promotes the growth of the body for building up itself in love by the proper working of each individual part. In other words, speaking positively, every member of the body of Christ can receive awards for faithfulness. Not talking about salvation. And I sometimes think about that because there are awards that are mentioned for being faithful. But what are we going to do with those awards? Well, in the book of Revelation, we're not going to say, look what I got. We're not going to be proud or arrogant. We're just going to be thankful that we've got an award or awards for being faithful, because we'll lay them at the feet of Jesus for eternity, honoring him who was the one who was victorious, who died, who rose again for us, victorious over the grave. So here is a very important principle. We are faithfully to build the church on Christ, not on men or women. Well, we should honor them for faithfulness, but we should faithfully build the church on Christ, who he is, and what he taught.